On Monday, Pope Francis marked his 10th year as Bishop of Rome. The first Pope from the Americas, the first from what is now called the Global South, the first from the large and old religious order known as the Society of Jesus. These are many firsts in a consequential papacy. He visited the Philippines in 2015 and at his last Mass in the Luneta gathered one of the largest crowds in history. But what has Pope Francis's impact been on the Church as a whole and on the Philippine Church in particular? Good evening. I'm John Nery and you are in the Public Square. The Roman Catholic Church and other religions play an important role in the public square. Understanding that role is part of the responsibility of citizenship. I am delighted to say that tonight we are joined by leading lights, true trailblazers in the Philippine Catholic Church who will try to make sense of the Francis papacy. Sister Mary John Mananzan, OSB, has served as president of St. Scholastica's College, Manila, prioress of the Missionary Benedictine Sisters, and national chair of the Association of Major Religious Superiors of the Philippines. She is a feminist, a theologian, a philosopher, an author, an activist. She joins us from Manila. Good evening, Sister Mary John.
Good evening.
Brother Karl Gaspar CSSR is a socio-anthropologist, a playwright, an interfaith scholar, a peace advocate, a missionary with the Redemptorists. He has taught at the Ateneo de Davao University and served as academic dean of the St. Alfonso's Theological and Mission Institute. He joins us from Cebu. Good evening, Brother Karl.
Brother Karl. Di yata naririnig.
Good evening, John.
Father Albert Alejo SJ is a member of the faculty of the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, incidentally the same university where Sister Mary John earned her doctorate. He, like Brother Karl, is a socio-anthropologist. He's a labor activist, an anti-corruption advocate, and also an esteemed poet, better known as Paring Bert. He joins us from Rome where it is morning. Buongiorno, Paring Bert.
Buongiorno a tutti.
And here in the studio,
Salamat, John.
Thank you. And here in the studio, we are joined by Rappler news editor and veteran religion reporter Paterno Esmaquel. Paterno studied comparative religion in pluralist societies in Singapore, and he outranks all of us here because here in the newsroom, we fondly call him Pope. Good evening, Pope.
Good evening. Thank you, John. And hello, Sister Mary John, Brother.
Hi, hello.
Again, good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining us in the public square. Sister, let me start with you. What is the most surprising thing about Pope Francis as Pope?
You mean, now I'm no longer surprised kasi before, you mean?
Okay.
I mean, kasi now I'm used to him eh. Pero before kasi, I was so surprised that he is so outspoken. You know, he's not yung parang he's not dogmatic, he is not narrow. He is such a human being, no? So that surprised me first because all the popes before him were medyo hindi ganon. But now I'm no longer surprised kasi that's his way, di ba? So I'm used to his being so human, so humorous, and talagang he's so at ease. Yung sabi nila at ease in his own skin. That is how I see him.
Brother Karl, 10 years ago, the new Pope compared the Catholic Church to a field hospital. What does that say about the church vision of Pope Francis? And has he lived up to that vision?
Most certainly. When I first heard him say that phrase, I resonated very much with him because I myself was in the periphery. As you know, I've been working among indigenous communities in Mindanao, where certainly you can smell like the sheep, no? So I was very much touched by that phrase, and certainly I continue to admire him for his consistency in walking his talk, because he has shown to us that whatever words he uttered, he will show it by way of example. And that certainly is a mark of Pope Francis.
Father Paring Bert, what makes this first Jesuit Pope a Jesuit Pope?
Wow.
What is it about him that is distinctively Ignatian?
Oh my
Well,
goodness.
number one, medyo nakakapagtampo. Ang pangalan niya, Francis. Pero
Dapat-
natutuwa ako kasi idol ko naman si Saint Francis of Assisi. Katunayan, I translated some
That's
of
right.
his points.
That's right.
Kaya, so, ang sa kanya, discernment, at saka, yung bang, kasi doon sa spiritual exercises, we are invited to use the imagination in seeing what is real. So, yung bang sinasabi na contemplate, imagine yourself in the midst of the events, there are so many people talking, fighting, etc. Kung mapapansin mo, yung kanyang mga encyclicals laging nagsisimula sa questionnaire. Parang pumapasok siya sa totoong buhay. Yun. So I think that is part of the Ignatian spirituality, getting into the mud. Sige, gano'n. Pero tapos mag-iisip, nag-iisipan muna bago tumalon. Yan. So discernment and getting in touch with the reality, but at the same time using being social poets at the same time. And that will, later on, siguro pag-usapan natin, that will create some controversy.
Okay, we will get to that. Pat, how's religion reporting changed during the Francis year? Has there been any change at all?
Well, first of all, we have to describe who Pope Francis is in the light of media coverage. Pope Francis undoubtedly is a headline maker. And as a headline maker, there are pros and cons to it. One is religion reporters tend to, latch onto the sound bites that are easy to understand. Pope Francis knows how to communicate via sound bites. He knows how to communicate to people. That's also part of his being a good Jesuit. But of course, it also has its pitfalls because sometimes there are nuances that are lost. Compared to other popes, I think Pope Francis has made use of the interview more. Compared to Benedict, compared to John Paul, previous popes never even gave interviews at all. So he knows
Here,
how to use
every trip of his features
with an interview,
an airplane
and then
interview.
he would have an interview with this news organization, this news organization. So, we hear a lot from him, and the media rightly or wrongly, we tend to latch onto the sound bites that are easy to understand. But there are also a lot of developments that the media aren't able to cover extensively. Like, for example, the Synod on Synodality. The Synod on Synodality, for our viewers, it's a years-long process initiated by Pope Francis to make sure that the Church listens to its flock, or everyone listens to each other. And so it's a consultation. There's a consultation at the parish level, the diocese level, but it doesn't get any big coverage because it's not a soundbite. So to answer your question, has it changed? It has changed in terms of the frequency of the sound bites, the number of interviews, and there are lots of church concepts that are made easy to understand. But at the same time, there are also certain reforms that Pope Francis is doing that the media, reporters aren't able to cover well. Number one, maybe because they're difficult to understand. Number two, not everyone understands the church language. And number three, I think the Vatican also, has its own troubles communicating to the public. Like, Synod on Synodality, of course, you would know what it means if you read about it, but how do you simplify it for a wider audience? It's something big that Pope Francis is doing. I think it's a defining, it's the defining hallmark of his pontificate so far. It's not getting any big coverage. So I think we have lots of work to do in that regard.
Let me pick up on something that Paring Bert said and then direct my question to Sister Mary. No, the question of the name of the Pope. No, so he's the first Pope to name himself after one of the greatest saints of the Catholic Church, Francis of Assisi. Did that surprise you, Sister? Kasama ba yun sa pagkatotoong tao niya, choosing to model himself after somebody so simple?
Yeah, well, no, really, I didn't give that much thought. I did not give much thought what he's going to call himself.
So, yung sinabi naman ni Paterno, Sister, about the Pope speaking in sound bites. I mean, he speaks to us more like a pastor rather than like the philosopher that John Paul II was or the theologian that Benedict was. Do you share that view?
I mean, if you mean he talks like parang ordinary conversation, I like it. I like the way he talks, he doesn't pontificate. Pontiff nga siya, pero hindi siya nagpo-pontificate. Nakakatawa, no? Other people who are not even popes, they pontificate. Pero siya, pontiff lang kasi hindi siya nagpo-pontificate, di ba? Ako gusto ko
Basta nagpo-pontificate ka na.
Hindi ba? Kasi gusto ko yung gano'n yung ang sabi kong very human. At saka, hindi siya natatakot magsabi, no? Like for example, nung first trip niya sa abroad as bababalik. And then yung mga delicate topics like LGBT, mga gano'n, he doesn't hindi niya iniiwasan yung subject matter. Sabi lang niya, now if I meet a gay person and he is seeking God, who am I to judge?
Yeah.
Hindi ba ang gandang sagot yun? Hindi, I will not talk about that because that's really against the church, mga ganun-ganon. Wala siyang ganun eh. Kaya sa akin, I like the way he talks. He talks like a human being na walang masyadong, yung masyadong narrow, masyadong legalistic. Hindi siya ganun. Talagang taong-tao siya.
To Brother Karl, Paring Bert, and also Sister Mary John, where does Pope Francis fall short?
What?
Where does he fall short?
Meron ako. Meron ako kaagad ang fall short.
Okay.
Alam mo kasi, although I don't doubt that he cares for women. He does that. He is concerned about women. Pero meron konting kulang pa siya to understand the gender issue. Alam mo yung kanyang he condemns totally yung gender ideology na sinasabi niya. Okay, I know there are certain what do you call this, exaggeration of that na ngayon lalaki ako, bukas babae ako. That's too much, no? Pero the feminist principle, he will consider it ideology, but it is not ideology in the pejorative sense. What I suspect is he doesn't really actually understand what women want when they say we want to be equal. They do not want to be the same. Kasi sinasabi niya, it should not be, ganyan. They should not aim at being the same. We are not aiming to be the same. You can be different but equal. Di ba? Ang tingin ko, kailangan pa niya ng konting exposure to genuine feminists, hindi yung mga exaggerated ones na ganyan-ganyan. Kung alam lang niya kung what is the essence of feminism, and he is not going to make a total generalization of all this, the gender ideology is parang from the devil pa nga ata yun sinabi niya. Hindi ba? So tingin ko, on that point, he needs a little bit more exposure to the woman question.
Sister, we'll get back to that.
Sige.
I'm going to ask Brother Karl and then Paring Bert your own views.
John, I take it from another point, although I agree with Sister Mary John on the gender and women issue. Even with the LGBT, despite what he said regarding who am I to judge, there's still not a very clear direction as to where the church should be vis-a-vis some of the really advanced queer theology that's being promoted by many theologians. No? But overall, I am just so impressed and so satisfied and so sometimes so overwhelmed by the very positive profile of what he has been saying that you cannot almost, think of shortcomings. Because if you compare it, I'm 75 years old and I've had 5 popes in my lifetime. And
I saw more.
and certainly, there is such a big, huge difference between how Pope Francis has acted as a pope compared to the previous one. So, in
I
that
agree.
sense, it almost is so undeserving on his part to be critiqued. Although I've been reading some of the articles that have come up because, as you know, given his 10-year anniversary, there's been quite a number of write-ups, both in mass and in social media, and some critique, very interesting. And I thought I resonated with at least one, which had to do with the Ukraine war. Because when the war erupted, it took a little while before the Pope made any statement condemning Russia for its sheer violent attack on the Ukrainian people, no? Considering that earlier he did say something about the nuclear weapons and he condemned it. And as we know, Russia is toying with the idea of using nuclear weapons. So there was a bit of a delay in responding to that. But I just sort of made some kind of an explanation to that myself, considering that there really are very serious diplomatic repercussions, for a pope to come out immediately regarding certain issues. But otherwise, other than that, as I said, I'm just so impressed by what he has been doing, what he has been saying, that it's almost so unfair to make any judgment against him.
Thank you, Brother Karl. Paring Bert?
So, katulad nung iba, I'm impressed. I remember John Paul II for his philosophy of the human person, labor, laborem exercens, and drama. Benedict, parang dumaan lang, sandali. I don't have quotations from Benedict, but then all of a sudden you have Pope Francis. And I started, constructing PowerPoint presentations very, very early. Siguro ang napansin ko lang, hindi naman fault, pero siguro parang desire lang. Pope Francis reveals his sources. In terms of literature, much of it would be, siyempre, sources, quotations, he reveals his inspiration. Very little from Asia. Except siguro Gandhi. Pero sana mas nakukote niya si Karl Gaspar, si Mary Jan for feminism. I don't think kulang pa yung exposure niya sa banda sa atin. Tinitignan ko yung mga sources niya. Okay, marami siyang Dostoevsky, even poetry of Baudelaire. Once nabanggit pa rin niya si Hopkins, pero what about Panikar? What about Felix Wilfred? Kulang. So doon siguro parte yung kulang. Baka kulang siya ng advisor. Kahit na merong mga malapit sa kanya doon sa bandaron. And once, hindi lang once, several times we attempted. We sent a note asking him to pray for the Philippines in terms of what is happening to us, so many killings. There was no response. Siguro maraming filter. We managed to talk to Turkson, Cardinal Turkson, as close as Cardinal Turkson. Pero
Si
wala.
Taglay, di ba close ako?
Sana man lang mabanggit sa sa mga prayers. Hindi lang yung kita ang mata pagdadasal ng Pilipinas, pero sa mga public prayers niya, sana nabanggit man lang, no? Kasi binabanggit naman niya yung Rohingya, binabanggit yung Syria, Ukraine. By the way, he has an encyclical on Ukraine. Although Mabagal yun ng konti kasi nga ang problema, the Catholic Church in Russia has a different position. Maybe that delayed. So in other words, in terms of geography of his sources, maybe he needs more exposure to our part of the world. And we are an important part of the world.
Well,
John?
yeah,
Can
that's
I
very
just
interesting.
ask
Yeah, go ahead.
Paring Bert a question? Paring Bert, you mentioned something about filters. Can you talk to us more about it? What do you mean when you
About
say
what?
that
About
they might have been filters preventing your
Filter.
letter, your note, or your request from reaching Pope Francis? I suppose, yeah, you were mentioning something about that a while ago, right? And I suppose it's about the drug war and President
I
Duterte.
don't
What
know
were the
about
contents of the
the
letter?
filters, but definitely there have been filters. Kasi what we wanted was just two things. One is to publicly pray for the Philippines, what is going on in the Philippines, especially during the time of Duterte. And second, if he would allow a visit from the victims of the extrajudicial killings and listen personally directly to the victims. And we will look for transport, uh, plane fares. If we could bring maybe one or two or three families to Rome. After all, he visited the victims of Yolanda. He is concerned about what's happening to us. But we reached, sabi ko, Cardinal Turkson, we reached the Vatican Nuncio, who
Cardinal
promised to
Tagle.
relay our request. Hindi ko alam kung yun ba yung filter o ano.
Do you think, Paring Bert, that there were bishops from the
Mahirap.
Philippines who were blocking your request?
So hindi ko alam yung protocol nila. Nung nakausap ko si Cardinal Turkson, I don't know whether the word is blocking. Maybe they have levels of priorities, or I don't know. But Cardinal Turkson said, what do your bishops say? Yeah.
May I say something about that filter?
Yes,
Pwede?
please.
Oh.
No, kasi ang tingin ko, because you mentioned that, kasi I remember nung lumabas yung Fratelli Tutti, no? Ang dami naming nagbigay kami ng suggestion na gawing Fratelli Sorelli Tutti. Kasi yung encyclical niya is about inclusion, about fraternal sorority thing. But the thing is that kung sino-sino ang sinulatan namin, etc., etc. Pero walang nangyari. I don't see why you cannot say Fratelli Sorelli Tutti. Sasabihin nila, kasi galing kay St. Francis ng 13th century. But 13th century, nung araw yon. Pag nandito si Francis ngayon, I'm sure no hesitant at all. Fratelli Sorelli Tutti ang sasabihin. Kaya parang nakikita ko siguro yung ngayon ko lang naisip na baka may filter nga.
Well, this is the...
At John, excuse me lang kasi sabi mo we have only 45 minutes. Let's not naman dwell on the negative part. Gusto ko magsabi ng everything that I want to admire kay Pope Francis. No?
Yes, we will do that. But
That's right.
I have a question for Pat first, no? And I want to come to terms with some of the negative news about Pope Francis, because there has been negative news coverage about Pope Francis, especially in the United States. No, it's gotten very hostile. It actually shocks me.
In Germany.
Yeah, it actually shocks me as a lay Catholic to sometimes read about this. What do you think is happening here, Pat?
Actually, hindi na nga ako nanonood ng EWTN ngayon eh. I don't watch EWTN nowadays because you use the word hostile, I would use the word uncharitable. They've gone uncharitable towards the Pope. I think what's happening is they are bringing the problems of America. They are forcing the world to, to take as our problems to the things that they talk about there. Like the things about, the things about the traditional Latin Mass. I think that is where much of the pushback is coming from, because many of them say that the Pope is cracking down on the traditional Latin Mass. I mean, for our viewers, the Mass used to be said in Latin until the Second Vatican the Second Vatican Council happened, and now it's more open. The vernacular is used, and now Pope Francis is seen by many to be restricting the use of the traditional Latin Mass as opposed to the late Pope Benedict XVI, who opened the doors to more celebrations of the traditional Latin Mass. But I think, I mean, that is the root. I mean, the many Catholics, especially in the United States, you know, the United States has its own problems, and you know, they force the world to talk about their problems. But my question always is, elsewhere in the world, who talks about the traditional Latin Mass? Who talks about those debates? What are the problems of countries like the Philippines? I think I would always redirect it to that. I mean, the media coverage of Pope Francis in the United States has turned hostile, has turned uncharitable. I mean, sometimes I would even ask, are these Catholic stations still Catholic? I mean, you are calling the Pope the Antichrist.
Wow.
I mean, what do you call yourself? I mean, you profess to be Catholic, and then you attend the Mass where the priest says, together with Francis, our Pope, John, our Bishop. I mean, you profess that you are Catholic, but you are saying that the Pope is an Antichrist. I think it is very uncharitable, and I think we have to
Has
redirect
that spilled over to Philippine coverage of the Pope?
There are, well, not mainstream media coverage, because frankly, it is, you would have to read so that you can understand it. And, you know, many of our journalists, of course, have to, those covering the church in the Philippines, they usually cover a lot of other stuff. And, you know, the pandemic and the labor issues. I think...
May I say something about that?
Yes, sister.
Because I'm a Benedictine, and I love Gregorian chant. I used to sing it. But ang tingin ko, ang babaw naman. Ang babaw naman ay, na yun lang ang they will pick that up
Yes.
to say things that are terrible about the Pope. Sa akin, hindi lang it's mababaw. Sobrang superficial. Ang,
Yes.
ang religiosity or their Catholicity is so superficial. Ang tingin ko.
Yeah. But I guess we cannot gainsay how much they place, how much importance they place on liturgy. No? So for them, the battlefield is liturgy. No? I mean, I completely agree. The Pope has essentially pronounced the experiment of Benedict XVI as failed. No? He thought that would give people who like to follow the traditional Latin Mass, this safe space and so on. But what has happened is that it's become a source of resistance.
Correct.
So the Pope has decided no more. No, of course there are exceptions, up to the bishops and so on. But it's really a question of what did the Second Vatican Council say. Anyway, to go back to Sister Mary John's concerns. 10 years. This is a consequential papacy. No, he's written 3 encyclicals, 5 exhortations. What do you think he will be remembered for? I'll start with Sister, and then Brother Karl, and then Paring Bert, and then Pat. What do you think he will be remembered for generations from now?
I think he will be remembered for his compassion. Parang yun ang kanyang ini-insist palagi. To have compassion, hindi yung mga rules and dogma and ganito. Kundi, this is a mother church, sabi niya. We are in the womb of mother church. So it's really this whole caring, this whole, after all, Jesus said, there is only one commandment, and that is love one another. And I think that is the kind of thing that Pope Francis is emphasizing. Compassion, concern, especially for the poor, and not to exclude anybody, whether they are Protestant, Muslims, and all that. You know, so sa akin, yung kanyang inclusivity, yung, kasi talagang parang ang tingin ko, he is concretizing what Jesus said. And that is, to love one another as I have loved you. And how do you show that love? Today, di ba? Sabi niya, go to the periphery and be, you should smell like the sheep, di ba? You should not be airport bishops. I remember he said that before, di ba? Do not be airport bishops. Ang ibig niya sabihin, the most important thing is how do you show concern, forgiveness, mercy. And these are all what Jesus wanted us to learn and to practice. And I think that is what he's trying to emphasize.
Thank you. Brother Karl?
Yeah, for me, John, there are three areas that I think are very significant contribution of Pope Francis. First is this whole area of simplification, to simplify. Well, from the moment he chose Saint Francis for his name, that already indicated symbolically that he was going to push for greater simplification in our church. And that's why recently he's been really harping on this whole problem of clericalism in the church, including the use of titles like Monsignor, which clearly indicates just his desire to simplify the structures of this very bureaucratic church. That simplification is also seen very well in the manner that he relates to the people. You know, I was in Tacloban at the height, months after Yolanda, when he came to sympathize with the victims. I was right there in front of the altar, and the typhoon was coming. And yet, I'm sure he knew that the weather situation in the Philippines was very bad, but still he took the risk because their plane was actually the last one to leave. After that, the typhoon really raged across Tacloban. The second point I'd like to see is, and this is very much from my perspective as a missionary who have been working mainly in Mindanao, there have been concerns in Mindanao to which Pope Francis' utterances had a major impact. One is, of course, the whole area of interfaith or interreligious dialogue, especially that document on human fraternity for world peace, which was co-signed by the leader of the Muslim world. Secondly, his visit to Canada and to Peru, where he showed his great sympathy for indigenous peoples and how he's very concerned with their plight. And related to that is of course, the whole climate justice perspective, because Laudato Si, I think, is one of the most significant encyclicals ever published by the Roman Catholic Church, by a pope, and that, I think, has had a major impact in terms of advancing the ecological advocacy throughout the world. And lastly, of course, we know that part of the reason why the traditionalists have been ganging up on him and demonizing him is because of the consequences of Predicati Gaudium, his attempt to really de-emphasize the clerical status of the Curia by bringing in women and lay people into the dicasteries. And I think that will have very long-term consequences for the church.
Thank you, Brother Karl. Paring Bert?
Yeah, I agree with Carl and the Sister Mary Jan. Siguro, three things, three P's. One is, he will be remembered as a pastor. Yung iba kasi nga, as philosopher, as theologian, as pope. He is
Sorry, we're having some difficulty right now. The connection with Rome is a little choppy, which might be a metaphor for church relations.
alone.
Hello, Paring Bert, can you hear us?
So he's a pastor.
So the first, he's a pastor, yeah? Sorry. Again, we can't seem to get through to Rome. Paring Bert, once we have the chance, we'll get back to you. I'd like to ask Pat here. How do you think Pope Francis will remember? I mean, I'm not saying he's gonna keel over tomorrow, right? I mean, he looks like he's still got a spring in his step and all that. How do you think he'll be remembered?
Number one, I think he will be remembered as a divisive figure in the Catholic Church, in the sense that, you know, he really rocked the boat. And he made sure that the true message of the gospel for the poor and the neglected gets across, no matter what the opposition may be. So that, yeah, it divided certain sectors of the church because it, you know, some people would like to focus on other things aside from, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty. Some would want the pomp and pageantry of the pre-Vatican II church. So, I mean, that has been a source of division in the Catholic Church. He is a divisive figure in that sense, but he is also a uniting figure in the sense that Pope Paring said a while ago that he is a pastor. I would want to go back to how he was described by a Catholic author. I forgot who, but during the earlier years of his pontificate, he was described as the world's parish priest. I think that is the more important image that I'd like to remember Pope Francis with, the world's parish priest. You know, the parish priest doesn't just issue encyclicals or pronounce dogma or, sit up on a throne. A parish priest walks with people, listens to people, and makes sure that, their concrete needs are attended to. Not just giving motherhood statements, like, for example, that the Catholic Church prohibits same-sex relations. His first step is always, can I walk with you? That is the spirit of the synod on synodality. I mean, walking with people and listening to people. I think that is the more important trait. I mean, being a parish priest of the world, and the whole world, thankfully, listens.
Maybe one last question. Let's talk about his impact on the Philippine church. Sister Mary Jan, if you're there, Brother Karl, Paring Bert, I counted of the 75 active bishops, he's consecrated half of them. None of the archbishops were consecrated by him, although he did appoint the new Archbishop of Manila and raised him to the rank of cardinal. But that's not the only way to gauge his impact on the church. What is the impact of Pope Francis on the Filipino church? Sister Mary?
Are you asking? Yeah, ako, it's not so much, the structural impact and all that. Sa akin, the impact is what he is, no? Yung sinabi nga natin lahat, that he is a pastor, that he is compassionate, that he is really going back to the original message of Christ, which is to love one another. For me, the impact is more spiritual rather than hierarchical, structural, political, whatever. Sa akin, nung nagpunta siya rito talaga, and then we were all there in Luneta. I was there. It was raining and everything. And then when we came home, sa akin, ang impact niya talaga is sa spirituality of the church. Yung talagang nakita nila na ito dapat ang magiging, ito ang simbahan natin dapat, yung compassionate church, na yung iba nyo sa communion, sasabihin nila na yung mga divorced people should not take communion. Tapos sinabi niya na that communion is not something a reward. It is a medicine. It is something that should help people who are sick, di ba? Ibang-iba yung pananaw niya sa at ang tingin ko of all the popes, I don't know all the popes, but for me, he is nearest he is nearest to the fulfillment of what Jesus wanted his church to be. That is for me the impact of Pope Francis. More within the kind of Christians and Catholics we are, ang impact niya doon rather than whether there are more cardinals na mga Pilipino or not. No? So, and that is more important for me.
Thank you. Brother Karl?
Yeah, in my case, John, I differentiate what is the reference to church in the Philippines, because we're not a monolithic church, no? As you know, we are constituted by different groups. So I start with the bishops in general. Of course, there are exceptions, but this is my observation. And I in my Facebook wall yesterday, I wrote about this. You know, I was very active in the Mindanao Solo Church in the 1970s, and I've been really watching and monitoring how it has functioned as a church, as a local church across the 15, 17 dioceses in Mindanao. In the 70s and 80s, up till about early 90s, when we had the Pope like John Paul II and Benedict even, you know, when the Pope was a bit traditionalist, even earlier, Pope Paul VI, although he was quite progressive but still quite traditionalist, around that particular period, the Mindanao Solo Church and the bishops, not everyone, but a big majority of them were very progressive. They spoke about justice, they spoke about human rights, they spoke about preferential option for the poor. And I know very well, as I visited the dioceses, that I could see at the ground level that the bishops encouraged a lot of programs in social action and so on and so forth. But it's very ironic that under Pope Francis, with all these very progressive ideas, our bishops there have become quite timid. They have not been as prophetic as the batch of bishops in the 70s and 80s. And I really wondered why. And it's such an irony that when you have a pope like Pope Francis, then there's almost like a silence and indifference, apathy on the part of most of the bishops in Mindanao, except a few. So that's why. But secondly, at the middle level of priests and religious and lay people who are able to tune in to new ideas in the church, of course, we have been very much inspired by the example of Pope Francis, the encyclicals, the exhortations. We've studied them, used them, and did everything we can to popularize this. And yet feeling very frustrated that at our local churches and our local parishes, local dioceses, there's very little support among the clerics who seem to be hesitant to really follow through many of the things that Pope Francis have been uttering these past 10 years. Thirdly, on the part of the ordinary people, the lay people, of course, there are still different categories, no? There are those who, because they're members of basic ecclesial communities and are close to the parish priest and have chances for lay formation and so on. Again, depending on what are the theological positions of the parish priest, then if the parish priest and or the religious assigned to that parish would provide them opportunities to look at some of the teachings of Pope Francis, then they too would have been very much impressed. But as we know in the Philippines, the majority of our lay people are, to quote, but PCP2, unchurched, unevangelized. They're out there. Look at Cebu. Where are the people, the Catholics in Cebu now? They're in mainly devotional practices, all the way from the Sinulog at Santo Niño Shrine to the Simala and everywhere. There's very little in the Archdiocese of Cebu that could make you really wonder what has been the impact of Pope Francis in this Archdiocese. So in a way, you really have to know once the answer to the question, where is the church in the Philippines vis-a-vis Pope Francis?
Thank you, Brother Karl. I wonder if it's a generational thing also. We're dealing with a generation formed under the influence of a great Pope, no? John Paul II. It might take more time. I wonder if Paring Bert was able to rejoin us.
Yeah. Sorry.
Hi,
Sorry,
Paring
it
Bert, sorry.
registered unknown error. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just wanted to add, okay, the being pastor is important and probably more known. The second is, I think Pope Francis is also a prophet. And he could be a pastor, but he also disturbs, and he could be blunt. But prophet in the sense na, for example, even the ecology advocacy is a way of a different kind of being prophet. Na, not prophet of doom, but a prophet in terms of calling attention to an important issue. He's also a prophet in terms of calling attention to the migrants, the forced migration, human trafficking, all these things. No? Napaka-importante.
I'll ask the same question.
But at the same time, I would like to add a third P, poetics and poetry. I think part of his humanity is that he does not just read philosophy and theology, but he reads poetry, he reads drama, he reads novels, he reads women writers. Yung ganun, ano? Tapos at a certain point, when he was talking to social movements, he said, I call you social poets because you create. Even in the stark and dark situation, you're able to imagine a different kind of possibility. So I call you social poets. In other words, he's not just a pastor with very practical pronouncements. He's not just a prophet with strong words, but he's also a poet in his own right. And therefore, there is mysticism in his activism. So yung iba matapang, pero kulang ng metaphor. kulang ng humanity. Ganon, ano? So, yung iba may social analysis, pero kulang nga ng poetics of the imagination. I think at this point, when things are stark and dark, we need the imagination. We need the arts. And in Laudato Si, he says that. Given the ecological crisis, we need all forms of knowledges, from scientific to spirituality to literature to arts and, of course, religion. So I really like that man.
Okay. Thank you,
Yeah,
Paring
doon sa
Bert.
Pilipinas, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so yeah, pastor, prophet, and poet. A fourth P, Paterno. Your thoughts?
Prophet, poet. At
Paternalistic.
yung impact niya sa Pilipinas, genius yung nakaisip nung tawag sa kanya na Lolo Kiko. Nagkaroon ng lolo
Yun
ang
nga,
mga
lolo nga
Pilipino. Hindi na ang papa, hindi na lang papa. Lolo pa. Iba ang appeal sa Pilipino ng lolo. Someone who takes care of you, someone who, can walk with you, can listen to you. Kahit pinapagalitan ka ng magulang mo, nandyan ang lolo mo. Lolo Kiko. I think that's his biggest impact on Filipinos.
That's nice.
Wow. There's so much more that we can discuss, but unfortunately, we've run long, so we need to call it a day. To Sister Mary John Mananzan, Brother Karl Gaspar, Father Albert Alejo, and colleague Paterno Esmaquel, thank you for your insights into this consequential Francis papacy and for your candor. This corner of the world is part 2 of the public square. Thank you. That's it for us tonight. The next step for engaged citizens is always to take a more active part in rebuilding our democracy. That includes both believers and non-believers. See you in the public square. This is John Nery. Thank you and good night.